Is it ethical to prescribe a placebo pill for depression?
Okay, so I understand depression to be a mental health condition which can range from mild to moderate to severe, which can be treated in several different ways, such as with pharmacological therapies or with talking therapies. And I understand a placebo pill to be a treatment that's given that doesn't have an active therapeutic ingredient, but has very effective results in patients because they believe that it has efficacy. So some people may say that it's ethical to give people placebo pills because it removes the aspect of the side effects, specifically in depression, which are quite commonly associated with antidepressants that are prescribed. However, I personally believe that it's not ethical to give placebo pills. I think something that's really important is the patient-doctor relationship, and which is built on trust. It's built on informed consent and making a joint decision together to try and get the best impacts for the patient. And I don't believe that giving someone a placebo pill, which could be viewed as misleading and dishonest, I think it would really break this relationship, and I think it would have an impact on a patient's care. And I also think that by giving someone a placebo pill, it's also depriving them of effective therapies that we know of, like the antidepressants, which we really understand how they work. Whereas with the placebo, whilst we know it can be effective, we don't truly understand who it works in and when it works. So I think that's something also really important to consider, that we're always giving the patients the best care that we can. So I think in conclusion, I don't believe that it is ethical to give a placebo pill. But I do think, going back to the point of people that may support it and saying that it's good because it doesn't have the side effects that are typically associated, there's been some research out that I read very recently that looks at the effects of exercise as a treatment, and it's been shown as having really effective results, almost quite similar to the levels of antidepressants. So I think if we are concerned about side effects and trying to look at other treatments, something like exercise may be more effective and more manageable than a placebo pill.
Discuss the following statement. In medicine, the patient is always right.
So for us in the healthcare industry, our point of care is always patient-centered. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that patients do have a very good understanding of their own health. They can feel the symptoms themselves. They have a really good understanding of maybe when they started, what sort of pain it is, that they can really help tell doctors. And also in the age of the internet, when there's things like you can search them up on Google, there's now AIs that sometimes you can type in your symptoms and they can come up with diagnosis. So I do think that patients can have a good understanding of their own health and their own care. However, for us as medical professionals, I believe it's our job to help and assist them, that they can't make all of these decisions on their own, because sometimes Google's not right all of the time, and maybe we can do extra examinations and tests that can really give us a different side to symptoms than they might have initially understood. I think what's really important is that all about healthcare is this patient and doctor relationship, and having informed consent and making the decisions together and working together. You both have information, and it's about working together to build a bigger picture. So I do think that whilst patients have a good understanding that doctors are necessary and sometimes can help guide patients in the right direction. I also think it is important to understand the idea that not all patients are the same, and that some do not necessarily have the capacity to really understand and make informed decisions about their own health. Some people might not have capacity because of psychiatric illnesses, because of alcohol and drug intoxications, or because of their age and understanding. For example, children, they're not going to be able to make decisions about their own health if they're not really understanding what is going on. So I think it's also important to understand that, again, not everyone can have that capacity to make the decision. So I think overall, it's important to always take on board what the patient says because they have the best insights. It's them that is living that life. But I do think that medical opinions is really important to help build the best patient care overall.
The NHS Constitution for England outlines the principles, values, rights and responsibilities that underpin the NHS. Do patients have responsibilities when accessing NHS services?
Okay, so to some extent I do think they have responsibilities. As healthcare workers, we deserve respect. We deserve to be treated nicely and fairly. And I think something that I've seen recently in the news is the increased use of body cameras that are having to be used on front lines in hospitals because of abuse that has been given by patients. And so I do think it is a responsibility for the patients to treat everyone with respect and treat them how they would like to be treated. And also, to another certain extent, being able to turn up for the appointments that they've booked and really communicating with their healthcare provider if they need any reasons to extra access for their appointments, if they need the extra time to get there. And I think having that ability to communicate and respect in that way is going to build a much better relationship between the patients and the healthcare staff. However, I do think having the idea of a patient being completely responsible for their health and for everything isn't really what we aim for as healthcare workers. It's on us to help empower patients, to help inform them of anything when it comes to health, whether that be diet, whether that be exercise, whether that be what medications they're on and when they need to take them, and really helping them understand either their conditions or just how they can live the healthiest life that they can. And so I think it's important to appreciate the privilege that we have in being able to help educate patients in this way and how helpful we can be. Because at the end of the day, we have the medical knowledge and patients do not necessarily have that knowledge, and it's our job to guide them. So I think overall, whilst patients do have some form of responsibility when it comes to their health, ultimately, it is our job as healthcare workers to help lead and educate that.
Why does a 9-year-old typically require a parent to consent to medical decisions on their behalf?
So I understand consent to be where somebody is explained the treatment or anything that is going on, and for them to be able to understand it, retain it, weigh it up, and to be able to communicate why they've come to that decision and that they understand everything. And for a 9-year-old who does not have the maturity and the understanding, this would probably not be possible. Therefore, a parent or a guardian is often used to give consent on their behalf, who can understand and show that they have informed consent when it comes to the procedure on behalf of the child. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some very rare cases where 9-year-olds can have treatment without the consent from the parents, and this is often in life-saving scenarios where there is not a parent that is available and it needs to be done in an emergency. I think it's also important to remember that Gillick's competence does say that people under the age of 16 can give consent if they've showed their intelligence and their maturity, and to really follow those 4 factors that I said before of understanding, retaining, weighing it up and communicating. But I do not think that this would be possible in a 9-year-old, as I said before. So overall, it's really important that we always gain informed consent from a parent or a guardian on behalf of a 9-year-old child.
Some pharmaceutical companies have been criticised for pricing essential drugs at unaffordable rates. Do pharmaceutical companies have ethical responsibilities to ensure access to their medications?
So I understand pharmaceutical companies to have a business model where they inject millions and millions of pounds into research and development of different drugs, where they try and take them through to clinical trials, which ultimately are then delivered to us here in the NHS. But I also understand that all of these millions and millions of pounds do not necessarily always equate to this successful drug that is working in the NHS that easily. And I think I've read somewhere that out of all of the drugs that end up going to clinical trials, only 10% of them go on to then get approved and to be then used in the NHS. So, with that understanding of the business model, for them to be profitable, they are going to have to charge more for their drug than it costs them to make, for them to continue. So I think it's important to acknowledge that they will have to charge that to continue the experimentation, to continue pushing our healthcare and improving healthcare for everyone for the better. And I also think we have seen cases of pharmaceutical companies doing things for non-profit. For example, the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was done for non-profit and was rolled out internationally with the aim to be as accessible to everyone as possible. However, I also understand that this does not happen every single time. There are some famous cases in the news, particularly in America, with the oxycodone and the pushing profits and leading people into drug addictions and really being unethical with how they are selling these drugs to patients. Also, as a business model itself, they have to please shareholders, they have to fight for these profits. It's a very competitive business. There's the idea of a patent where someone that has created a drug has rights and access, that they are the exclusive suppliers and have the exclusive knowledge of that drug for a set period of time, where they then have to go and make that profit before the generic drug companies can come in and copy that drug and try and make it for cheaper and sell it. And so this can be seen as a positive because it drives that competitive advantage eventually to try and get the price down as low as possible. But also with the patents, they can charge however much they want. And we have seen negative side effects of medications becoming increasingly more unaffordable. And with the NHS budget not necessarily being able to stretch to this, that meaning patients can miss out on these really life-saving medications. So I think it's important to understand they do have to have ethical understanding and a basis because they are providing the patients with the drugs, but also understand that for us to get these drugs, there is going to have to be a competitive market when it comes to it.
Should prisoners serving life sentences be treated under the NHS?
Yes, prisoners that are serving life sentences and any prisoners should be treated under the NHS. In the NHS, we do not discriminate. It's all about giving equal healthcare to all and making sure that everyone has the access. Everyone has the right to access healthcare. And actually, I think it's really important to understand that in the prison population, sometimes they need that extra support. I think there is a kind of disproportionate high amount of mental health conditions and substance abuse and addictions like that is often found in prisons, which require a lot of support from healthcare members. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that and also understand that prisoners are humans just like anyone else, and they deserve that respect, and people that are coming out of prison deserve that support and help with their health so that they can be rehabilitated back into society, so that they can continue moving onwards and upwards in life and really having that support. And I think one of the first things with that is helping them with their healthcare, in particular with mental health conditions, with really allowing them the confidence and the support to really feel like they can transition from the prison environment back into society. So I definitely think prisoners that are serving life sentences should be given equal access to healthcare.
At what point does an unborn baby become alive?
So this is an interesting question, and lots of people have very different opinions and viewpoints. So I think some people who think about it more literally might consider when there's a heartbeat or when the brain develops. Some other people might think more in terms of when it's fertilized, when something becomes viable. other people who particularly might have religious beliefs about the idea of conception being the real key part to when something becomes alive, and others can even believe that it's not until the baby is born in that moment. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's so many different viewpoints and such a sliding scale on when people believe that a baby is alive. And it's really important when it comes to decision making for IVF, what we do with stem cells, when it comes to abortion laws, and really just general policy making when it comes to these situations. So, to conclude, there is no one answer to this question of when does an unborn baby become alive, and I think it's just important to acknowledge that different people will have different viewpoints on this.
A doctor posts a picture on social media wearing their hospital scrubs, and it shows the hospital environment in the background. What are the ethical concerns related to this situation, and how should it be addressed?
So I think one of the key ethical considerations is confidentiality in this. If a doctor is posting something on social media, we do not know who has access to this picture, who it can be sent to. It's not under the control of the doctor. And in the background of the picture could be things such as patient faces, identifiable information such as results. Quite often in hospitals there's a whiteboard that has, names and information about patients on what bed they're in and what ward they're in, and something like that is breaking confidentiality, and it's not fair on the patients. One of the key things about being a doctor is ensuring that there is respect for the patient, and that information about a patient's condition cannot be given to the public. And I also think in that sense, if somebody was to see it on social media, it would also break the trust that the general public has with the doctors. And I think a lot of patient-doctor relationships are built on trust. If someone feels that they've seen a doctor posting personal information about someone, they may be less likely to tell them about their condition, to be less honest, and then that's ultimately going to result in a decline in a patient's health. So I think that's really important to remember. So I think the two things is confidentiality and trust in the doctors, but also that social media sometimes can be used in a good way. That if it is controlled and, say, approved by a hospital in terms of promotional and actually actively trying to gain the trust of the public and trying to show, we've been doing this lately, which is really amazing, and the impacts that it's been having on the patients. So whilst 100% ethically we always need to ensure that there is trust, respect, confidentiality is remained for the patients, that sometimes social media can be used in a good way, but in this specific case, which is asked in the question, it is not appropriate.
How would you manage a situation where a patient who you've been treating for a long time insists on leaving you a significant portion of their will to you?
So GMC guidelines and local hospital guidelines suggest that if gifts are given under £50, they can be shared within the whole healthcare team, but for anything above this, then it would need to be declined. So in this case, with a will, this would not be appropriate. I think it's important to understand that we should treat patients equally and based off clinical needs and not based off monetary value. And so I think that's really important to establish, particularly in the doctor-patient relationship. I think in this case, if someone is willing to give that sort of money to you, then you obviously have a good relationship to start with, and to explain to them that you are happy to treat them without any money, that is not why that they go to treat people. It's because they want everyone to live as healthy and as best life as they can. And that if they truly want to make an impact on the hospital, that maybe things such as a donation to the local hospital charities is which can have the most impact on all patients and just the general hospital. So overall, in this case, it would not be appropriate to accept in the will. And the important thing is to highlight to the patient that the money is not appropriate, but this does not mean that it is going to change how they are treated, and that if they truly want to have a monetary donation, that the hospital charity is probably the best place to have this impact.
Should there be stricter regulations on the types of experiments that can be performed on animals, even if it might slow the pace of medical advancements?
I think it's important to understand the order that experiments are typically carried out, especially when we are transitioning from preclinical experimentation into clinical trials. So from what I understand, majority of experiments are conducted on cells to begin with, and then progress onto multiple cells, and at these stages we test for toxicity, so how harmful is this substance or molecule that we're testing to the cell? Is it causing it to die? And then after that has gone through, we go to look at the efficacy, so how successful is this substance at doing what we intend it to do? And so it's important that we know all of these things before we transition onto the animal models to eliminate the harm as much as we can. And also in current research, there are multiple other alternative techniques to animal models, such as induced human pluripotent stem cells and iPSCs in general, the developments of CRISPR techniques and how much information things like that can give us, and in vivo versus in vitro experiments. So whilst historically it may have just been cells and then straight to animal, in recent times we really have such a plethora of experimental techniques available to us. But I also think it's important to understand that we as a society really place a lot more value on human life when compared to animal life. And to be able to test system-wide in things that are as similar as we can to humans, it's really important to test these with animals before we go on to humans, so we're not putting any human life at risk. So I believe that in terms of the regulations, that we do have really good, strong regulations of the kind of preliminary experiments that need to be conducted before we transition to the animal models. But also that I think in the future we're going to be moving away from this traditional cells and animal models, and that with all of these new techniques being invented, that times will change. For more videos like this, be sure to check out our online course.